Question Lane. Solving problems through the process of questions and answers.
The Question Lane is a podcast where the goal is to solve problems through the process of questions and answers. Today's guest is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, in Boston, Massachusetts. As a researcher, she has published and taught in the fields of racial economic disparities, economics of education, and stratification economics. Today's series of questions and answers will focus on Area 1, economics, and Area 6, politics. Specifically, her academic papers entitled The Economics of Reparations and Reparations for African Americans as a Transfer Problem. Sorry for the background. Our guest is Dr. Francis, Dr. Dania Francis. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
What would you like to be referred to as, Dr. Francis or Dana? What will work for you?
Oh, you can call me Dr. Francis. It's easier. My name's Dania, but Dania Francis, but you can call me.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the pronunciation on that.
That's okay.
All right. So, Dr. Francis, is there anything you want us to know about you before we get started?
Sure. So I guess maybe it's important to note that I've been researching this topic of reparations now on and off for about 17 years. I have collaborated on the topic with Professor William Sandy Verity, and it's something that I have a deep interest in understanding further.
Okay. So as a researcher, I'm pretty sure you have an appreciation for words and definitions and basically putting into application a structure of understanding so that we could understand what we're dealing with. When it comes to the word racism, because I noticed that was used in a couple of the academic papers that we'll talk about today. So when you use the word racism, what exactly do you mean?
So, I mean, racism means multiple things. A lot of times when people think about racism, they think about sort of individual animus, held by individuals in society. When I think about racism, I'm more inclined to include sort of the structural societal racism that makes it so that our institutions, policies, laws, disproportionately disadvantage people of color, specifically what we're talking about today, Black people in this country.
So just to be accurate, you're talking about an institutional structure that's mistreating non-white people, specifically Black people?
Correct, right? Because you can have individuals who believe they are not racist in their actions and their thoughts, right, and still have institutions, right, that discriminate and are set up in ways that perpetuate racism, right? So I think that when we limit our idea of racism to individuals, it's easy for people to say, oh, well, racism, is disappearing. People are not a lot of people feel that way, or it's a fringe group of, white supremacists who feel that way. And when in actuality, a lot of the structures in our society are set up in ways that disproportionately discriminate against Black people in what I would call structural racism.
I came across a definition a while back that I thought was very accurate, that encompassed the structure of racism from a macro perspective and a micro perspective, and I wanted to see what you have to say about this definition. So racism is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in a known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you think that's the accurate definition of racism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has a lot of the elements of what I was trying to express. And really, that kind of harkens me back to the definition of a citizen in Haiti after the Haitian Revolution, right? They said, who can be a Haitian citizen? Well, anybody who is Black. Well, who is Black? Well, you're black if you, by definition, denounce white supremacy, right? So not this notion of race, you have to be phenotypically some way or something like that. No, anybody who denounces white supremacy can be considered black and can be considered a citizen of Haiti. This is, post-Haitian Revolution.
Before we get into the article, the last definition I want to focus on is justice. In your eyes, what does the word justice mean?
That's a good question. So, right, I mean, it's a really broad question. So if I were thinking of it specifically in terms of race and discrimination and, really ongoing discrimination, justice to me means righting the wrongs of the past and making sure that we also address continuing and ongoing discrimination, right? So it's not justice. Maybe to preview a little bit, it's not justice just to have a reparations program and make amends. Justice also includes addressing the aspects of our society that contribute to ongoing discrimination.
Okay. Yeah, I came across another definition about justice, and it sounded reasonable to me as well, which is first part is guaranteeing that no person is mistreated, and then second part is a compensatory aspect, which is guaranteeing that the people who need the most help get the most constructive help. So do you think that's an accurate way of describing what justice could look like or should look like?
Right. I mean, that sounds kind of almost right in line with what I just said, right? Guaranteeing that nobody's mistreated, meaning addressing ongoing discrimination, right? But also having this compensatory aspect to it where we're righting the sort of wrongs and unlevel playing fields of the past.
Understood. So we're going to jump right into economics and reparations. So when you use the word reparations, can you explain what that is for people who might not know what that means?
Yeah, so even that becomes, I think, a question, right, that needs to be answered. So by definition, we think of reparations as involving, right, the making of amends to those who have been wronged, and those amends could be made through money or by other means. And when we talk about that notion of those who have been wronged, right, that brings up a question of, well, have been wronged for what, right? So in the context of reparations for African Americans, we often talk about reparations for slavery, but we could also consider, and we should consider, including the period of Jim Crow, state-sanctioned discrimination against blacks in this country, the period of laws during and after World War II and the New Deal, where we had things like redlining, which was, done and sanctioned by the government, right? So the question of reparations involves making amends for wrongs, and we have to talk about what are the wrongs, and it involves what is the way in which we're talking about making amends.
There was a conference that you referenced in your paper, the World Conference Against Racism. Can you briefly explain what that conference was about and briefly explain who put this conference together?
You know what? This would be a conference that was attended by my co-author, who would have more experience with that. So I don't want to give you false information.
I just found it interesting when I was reading through what you said in reference to the United States not wanting to participate in this conference because reparations was on the table. And I read a New York Times article where it was quoted as saying that then Secretary of State Colin Powell, he pulled out from it because he was basically told to not address reparations. So I just wanted to see if you had a comment about that.
Yeah, well, we have a history in this country of, even discussing the idea of reparations being this, taboo political discussion, right? The notion that Representative John Conyers, for, I guess, decades, right, proposed the bill just to study reparations, not to say, Black people should get reparations, but just to study the question of reparations, and that bill could not make it even out of committee, right? So it's not surprising that, especially during the political landscape of the time, when we were first writing that article, that the United States government would say, we don't want to be even, in any way politically associated with this question of reparations. The good thing, I think, the positive thing is that has changed. There have been many more politicians recently who have been willing to even open the idea and discuss the idea of what do we even mean when we're talking about reparations.
And I definitely want to address that a little bit later in the interview for sure.
Mm-hmm.
For those who might think that reparations is unattainable and it's never been done before, can you give a few examples of a few groups who have received reparations from the United States government?
Yeah, well, sort of the most prominent example would be Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. They received reparations for that wrong, and fought for and was allocated through Congress reparations for that. There is some debate over whether you can consider any government payments towards Native Americans actual reparations, and so I understand the nuances and the debate in that, and so I won't necessarily refer to any U.S. government payments to Native American groups as reparations. But there have been examples where the U.S. has recognized in the past their wrongs and has actually given out reparations payments for that.
So the Japanese would be a prime example in this case.
Correct.
Okay. You quoted a man by the name of Raymond Winbush and his concept of white capping. On page 2, Raymond Winbush has referred to white capping as denoting the habit of night riders who confiscated land from vulnerable blacks. So I just wanted to ask you, is that an act of economic terrorism against black people, the concept of white capping?
Absolutely. And so there's prominent examples we can think of in the past of that type of economic terrorism. We think of, Tulsa, Oklahoma. We think of Rosewood. But even outside of those prominent examples, there are sort of countless instances of black landowners being intimidated from their land, right? And when we look at some of the census records and the census data, and we see a lot of the phenomenon of what was happening during the Great Migration, we also see within the census they'll ask questions, right? About do you own your home, and is this home a farm, right? And so we can see, if we follow some of these decennial census records, people, black land owners, farm owners, right, in one decade, and then the next decade we find them, in cities, whether it's been, moved to southern cities or moved to northern cities. But what we see is this dispossession of land, right? And so just looking at the data alone don't tell us whether or not, all those instances were due to this sort of violent dispossession of land. But we do know through some of the narratives and what's the word I'm looking for? Testimony, right, of people in the past that this was something that was, relatively widespread.
So in addition to what you said earlier in terms of institutionalized economic terrorism in terms of redlining and instituting the black codes, Jim Crow, this act of economic terrorism was inputted into black people's lives by average white people. Would that be an accurate way to say that as well?
Well, I mean, what I would say is that, right, we can think of examples of, violent dispossession, right? That's one thing. And then when you talk to people today, they may say, well, that was the past, and that sort of thing is not happening any longer. So to that, I would say, number one, the past has repercussions for the future, right? A lot of wealth in this country is held in land, right? And from wealth, we are able to pass down wealth, and we have, sort of intergenerational transfers and therefore just intergenerational wealth disparities. One, so the past matters, but two, right? There is plenty of evidence of ongoing discrimination in the agricultural industry, in farm lending. In fact, there was a recent article in the New Food Economy, I want to say, by Bryce. I can get the actual citation for you to include later.
Please do.
Okay. But it was very interesting, and they document ongoing discrimination in the USDA against black farmers, right, in ways that cause them to have to forfeit their lands, right? So if that's still happening today, that just points to this issue I brought up earlier, that it's not enough to say, oh, we'll include discussion of, dispossession of land during the Jim Crow era in reparations discussions. Well, we also have to include this issue of ongoing discrimination by our government entities, right, in ways that disadvantage black farmers. What ways am I talking about? So, for example, being in control of who is allowed to apply for and receive subsidies, who is granted loans, right? The life of a farmer is such that it involves financing this year's production in order to pay for the activities that lead to your eventual crops, right? So if you don't have access to that liquidity, right, you're less likely to be able to be successful. You are more likely to end up having to sell or have your farm repossessed. So I'll wrap it up by saying I think it's important that we not only focus on those sort of blatant examples of violent dispossession, but also talk about the mechanisms, the economic mechanisms through which discrimination worked and continues to work to dispossess black farmers.
Well said.
Thank you.
You also wrote, without significant production capacity in place prior to reparations, a lump sum payment could actually result in absolute decline in black income.
Yeah.
What,
so that,
was this? Can you briefly explain what you mean when you say that?
Yeah. So that is based off of a second paper by Dr. Darity, Badisha Lahiri, and myself, where we looked theoretically at this question of reparations using the lens of the transfer problem in international trade. And what we basically find, right, is that it's quite possible you give a cash reparations payment, right, to black Americans, right? And let's say, you can finance that through, taxing non-black Americans, issuing bonds, some way you finance that. But you issue cash payments to Black Americans. Well, in the current environment, right, Black Americans' ownership of businesses, ownership stakes in companies, right, through stock ownership and so on, is so low, right, that even if Black Americans were not, spending their reparations payment on consumption, even if they were looking to invest, there is not a sufficient infrastructure within Black America, if you will, right, to take advantage of those reparations payments, right? So if I have a reparations payment and I say, okay, well, I want to, I want to save it. I want to use it for something. Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to go put it in, Chase Bank or something like that. Well, who owns Chase Bank? Non-Black Americans, right? And who benefits from the funds that are put into Chase Bank? Disproportionately, white Americans benefit from money in financial institutions because we know there are still disparities in lending, right? So that money would go into a system that lends the money out to people who are benefiting who are not Black Americans, right? So if there is no financial infrastructure and no and very few compared to the size of the U.S. economy as a whole, very few Black-owned businesses, right, then where we spend that reparations payment would end up lining the pockets again of non-Black Americans. Right.
So if I hear you correctly, it sounds like you're saying that if ADOS, Black Americans, etc., don't control the primary inputs in terms of their own banks, controlling land that produces crops, production, etc., that it wouldn't necessarily benefit us to the best case scenario. It'll essentially serve as some type of stimulus package for non-Black people.
Correct. And so saying that, and I say all that, and yet I am still a proponent of cash payments as reparations, right? Because saying that doesn't mean, okay, well, that means, we give that idea up. No, it means that we need to right now be investing in those infrastructures, right? And so, right, there are a few Black-owned banks, right? You think about, One United and so on. But we need to be developing more community development lending institutions, right? Like creating those structures such that if a cash reparations payment were to come, there would be places for Black people to invest that money back into the community.
And just for the record, I totally agree with what you said. I'm just providing context and some answers for people who might have questions or opposition to this, I think, necessary, act, legislation, policy, whatever you want to call it. So what would your response be to non-Black people that oppose being taxed to pay for reparations because they say that their ancestors arrived in the United States post-1865 and they didn't own slaves? What would your response be to people who have that type of reaction to the concept of reparations for American descendants of slaves?
So, one thing I would point out is that again, I don't think reparations should only encompass reparations for slavery. I think it has to also encompass the discriminatory laws and policies of the New Deal era, of the post-World War II era, especially because that was the time period of the growth, right, of the American middle class. Right, so that was the time period where people were buying homes, right, and generating wealth. And so even if people immigrated here after the time period of slavery, right, you will certainly find examples of, those same people's parents who benefited from a federal housing authority loan that was being denied to Black people, right? And that loan enabled them to buy into a neighborhood where the homes are now worth, $500,000, right? And so even if you believe that there's no longer discrimination in lending markets, which I don't believe, but even if you do, right, you have to recognize that allowing for no discrimination in lending markets now, right, puts Blacks at such a disadvantage when, buying a house now, I'd have to try to come up with, $100,000 just to get a down payment, whereas these people were allowed to get a mortgage and grow their wealth over decades and decades, right? So it's not just slavery. It's things that are much more recent. People's parents and grandparents disproportionately benefiting in ways that are passed down to them in the terms of being able to afford college, right? Being able to have a buffer that allows them to become an entrepreneur because they have something to fall back on, right? All of these things that lead to privilege because of this racial wealth gap.
So redlining and not being able to take advantage of the Homestead Act, not having access to GI Bills after the end of World War II for veterans, just a host of different reasons. And I totally agree with what you said, and I'm glad you explained that out. Also, what would be your response to these people would be classified as Black, but not necessarily American descendants of slaves? So specifically people from Africa or the Caribbean. What would your response be to people that fit in those categories that say that, hey, I believe that I have a claim to say that I want reparations from the United States government?
Yeah. So I have some evolving thoughts on this question, and this is a hot topic and a hot question within the reparations movement right now. So one thought, I'll start. My first thought is that who is eligible for a reparations payment depends on what we are saying the reparations payment is for, right? So if we say that there is a part of a reparations payment that should be because of slavery, right? And then there's also a part of a reparations payment that should be for discrimination during the New Deal and post-war era, right? That might involve two different groups who are eligible, right? So for slavery, in that case, perhaps it's saying you have to demonstrate lineage to, you have to demonstrate that you're a descendant of a person who was enslaved in the U.S., right? And, part of that argument is, involves a legal argument and whether you can demonstrate standing to show that you are, in fact, the descendant of a person who was wronged. I'm not a legal scholar, so I won't talk about that any further. But I think that if we are talking about sort of either ongoing discrimination or discrimination during the New Deal and post-war era, then we should also be talking about people whose descendants may not have been enslaved in the U.S., right, but who perhaps immigrated during a time period where they also experienced that discrimination. Okay, so the second thing that I think about that is, and again I say this because my thoughts are evolving. Why be divisive, right? Why not start from a standpoint of let's include all self-identifying Black Americans, right? And some people may say, well, then that might not stand up to scrutiny, right? Legal scrutiny. People can sue and say, this reparations payment idea is does not stand up because you're trying to give reparations to people that weren't here. Well, good. Well, let them sue, and then let them have the onus of suing and excluding people. Why would we start out excluding people and creating divisions within Black America, right, before we've even begun to discuss a reparations payment? So that's one thought. That's my second thought. And then my third thought is, when you do exclude people, there has been a history of people who, I'll give the example of what we talked about earlier, reparations for Japanese Americans. When reparations for Japanese Americans were initially passed through Congress, it was just for Japanese Americans. It turns out that there were also Japanese Peruvians, right, who at the time were also interred, who were taken from Peru and interred in the same concentration camps, right? They were excluded from the reparations program for Japanese Americans. They sued and later eventually won that part of the reparations payment should go to them. They received less than Japanese Americans did, but it just goes to show you that, right, even when you exclude people, there will be, there will be lawsuits. These things will be worked out in the courts. So why not start at a place of unity instead of division?
My thought process on that is, there's a lot of jokes that people make, growing up in terms of, I'm Black, but I'm 1/16 Cherokee, or I'm part Dominican, or I'm part, etc. The concept that comes to mind for me when it comes to this reparations discussion is that people are going to use, well, I'm part Black. I'm 4% Black. As a matter of fact, there's a case, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but there's a case right now that's going on where a guy is trying to identify as a African American, a white guy, because he has 4% lineage, that came through on a DNA test. So he
right,
could take
and he
advantage
was a
of
police officer or something, and I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
He wanted to take advantage of some type of government contracting because a certain percentage is supposed to be allocated for Black Americans. So that's what I mean when I talk about just being clear with who is supposed to be receiving this type of policy and who was really affected. That's what I mean, about being specific.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that. Right. I mean, that's, part of what Professor Darity and I wrote in our paper involved this notion of, self-identifying as Black on some, important or government document, that as a way to say, you can't just be, Johnny-come-lately and, now that reparations are being passed, all of a sudden I am Black and I identify as Black, right? Like you would have had to have some, 10 years prior identification mechanism where you self-identified. And I think that matters and that's important. But I also think that it would probably be a much smaller issue than what it's possibly made out to be, especially because even after after this notion of getting a reparations payment, there are a lot of people who just do not and would not want to be identified as Black. I love being Black, right? But there are my question is, how many people would put down on paper and broadcast to the world, now I am officially, Black, just to get this piece of the pie that we're talking about? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, there's been cases where, when white Americans self-identified as Native Americans to be able to take advantage of land that was redistributed to certain tribes. So I don't know. I wouldn't say it would be something that's statistically significant, but then again, white people surprise me all the time. So I couldn't give you a specific number, but I believe you called that a moral hazard in the paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have an estimate, especially in this first paper, an estimate of $3 to $5 trillion for what a reparations package will look like. I'm pretty sure that's increased by now, but
yeah, I was going to say that's low, right? That's low now.
Now, speaking of politicians, Marianne Williamson, she's in agreement in terms of Black Americans receiving reparations, but her estimation is I believe it's 300 to 500 million. I mean, not million, billion. I'm sorry. Do you think that she's just kind of catering to try to get Black votes to her, or do you think she's serious with her estimation? And that's over 10 years, I believe.
So I can't comment on how serious how serious she is. I think it matters that she was one of the only people on the debate stage during the one of the presidential primary debate she was in to sort of voluntarily mention reparations. So I think that in itself is important. But I do think that, a number of, 300 to 500 billion is low, right? Especially once you start including not just reparations for slavery, but when you start including the Jim Crow era, the New Deal era, the post-World War II era. I have a project ongoing right now with Nathan Rosenberg, Bryce Stuckey, Thomas Mitchell, and Derek Hamilton, where we are estimating Black land loss, so Black agricultural land loss from 1910, so not even talking about, even prior to 1910, from 1910 to around the 1970s. And, we come up, just for Black agricultural land loss, due to the reasons you and I were discussing earlier, right? We come up with numbers in the hundreds of billions, right? So not even talking about slavery, we're already talking about numbers in the hundreds of billions. So anything I think less than I think I would say around 6 trillion. Anything less than that, right, is not realistic, I think.
Totally agree. So other candidates that are running, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Andrew Yang, they, in theory, have supported reparations, but when you look at their policies on their websites, it's more policies that affect everyone. So, for example, Bernie Sanders has this concept called the Green New Deal, college for all, and jobs for all. Do you think something that's not tailored specifically to Black Americans will not necessarily help us, or do you think that just the little crumbs that do come our way, it'll be beneficial because we're not receiving anything now?
So I think those programs will benefit Black Americans. I think we should seriously consider those programs, along with like baby bonds and other programs that address wealth gaps. But those are not reparations, right? And so I don't think that we should confuse those with reparations. And I think that these broad-based policies that address wealth disparities, access to affordable housing, education. We need those type of policies in this country, and I support them. But I don't call that reparation, right? I think we also then need reparations.
So reparations would be something that's separate from a concept like the Green New Deal or college for all, or maybe Andrew Yang's policy, which is the freedom dividend, where he proposes to give all Americans 18 or over $1,000, to prepare us for the automated economy. So that would be something that's separate from those type of policies, correct?
I think those policies are great in that they would help chip away at the racial wealth gap, but they are not specifically targeting African Americans. They might disproportionately benefit African Americans because when we talk about the inequality and the populations that will qualify for those programs, Black people do fall into the demographics often that will qualify for those programs. So they may disproportionately benefit Black Americans, but that I don't think is a reason to say, great, that should serve as a reparations payment. No. And in fact, I have an op-ed in the Congressional Quarterly Researcher where I specifically discuss why I think these sort of programmatic solutions to reparations are subpar, right? And one of my main arguments is that I think it speaks of paternalism. I think it speaks of paternalism to say, well, we don't necessarily trust that Black Americans are going to improve their situation if we just give them a check. So instead, I think we should put together programs that dictate the ways in which we think Black Americans should benefit, right? And I just think that in this country where, freedom of choice and market freedom and capitalism has been so near and dear to so many, why is it that when we start to speak about reparations for Black Americans, all of a sudden, freedom of choice is gone, right? So, I think that there are some well-meaning people who would like to see programs like home ownership, educational investment, small business ownership thrive for Black Americans. And there's no reason that those people should not advocate for and provide resources for Black Americans who want to spend their reparations check on those things. But to force the issue by saying reparations have to come in these programs, right, I think does a disservice and is a paternalistic view.
That is very interesting. What was that article again? Because I want to look at that as well.
It was just an op-ed in the Congressional Quarterly Researcher. I can send you a link.
Perfect. So in your paper, Reparations and the Transfer Problem, which we referenced earlier, you talked about, you said under this scenario, the non-Black and unambiguous face a balance of payments as a secondary burden. Basically, you're talking about if Black people don't have like the ability to produce and be in control of that aspect, that it'll create a burden on us and possibly lead to us not coming out on a better side of receiving reparations. So can you talk about what are some programs, policies, or examples of how Black people now can try to focus on getting into production in terms of ownership and developing items and products now?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that comes to my mind first and foremost is a lot of Black people will want to use their reparations payment to improve their community in some way, right? And, one thing that we can start doing is forming lending clubs, right? So even if we don't have a, sort of formal financial institution, right, we can have lending clubs where we say, okay, we all have this money now. Let's pool our resources and let's invest in restoring this block, right? Like restoring this neighborhood and in that way improving all of our all of our home values, for example, right? So doing things that, we live in a very segregated country. I don't know, when or how that is going to change. And so as long as there are, neighborhoods and Black communities, then those Black communities should be invested in, right? And one of the ways to do that is to pool your resources through lending clubs and other financial instruments. So I think that's one way. The other way is to encourage entrepreneurship and small business ownership, right? One of the things I mentioned that was how wealth affords you the opportunity to try to start businesses and fail, right? If you have wealth to fall back on and you fail, well, you maybe learn something and you can try again. Right? If we don't have that type of wealth in our communities, we're too afraid to take risks and be entrepreneurs and start businesses because we can't fail, right? So those are the types of ways that we can even now begin to implement the infrastructure that can help us capture within the Black community any reparations payments.
So lending clubs, that's something I definitely want to look into. I spoke with Dr. James Jennings and also Chuck Collins in the concept of co-ops. That being used, do you think that's something that Black Americans could use in terms of forming businesses and having more of a democratic way of sharing the profits? Would that be something that would be that you would instruct us to do? Or does that make sense? Or what's your opinion?
Absolutely. And there's actually a really good resource. Let me see if I can find it right now on the history of Black co-ops. And it's by Jessica Gordon Nimhart, who is a Black female economist and wonderful. And I can try to look up the name of her study. But there is a history of Black co-ops in this country and cooperatives, collectives, right? I think that you've hit on something key and important.
Yeah, I definitely want to look into that for sure because, from the limited research that I looked into it sounded like it made sense. And to me, it would be an incentive for Black people to work together despite some of the negative stereotypes and just incorrect behavior that has been done over the years. I think it'll be something where, everybody would benefit from it. So it's not just, creating just an overclass of, wealthy Black people and, lower class Black people being employed under them.
Absolutely. And so her book, Jessica Gordon Nimhart, is Collective Courage, and it's a history of African-American cooperative economic thought and practice. I recommend.
For sure. I definitely want to look into that. You also touched on in this paper the importance of education and, building that base of people who are able to handle some of the problems that reparations might create, good problems in terms of developing capital, institutions and things of that nature. Can you really talk about how important education is in terms of getting involved in STEM and fields such as that?
Yeah. So, I'll say that education is key, period, right? Especially, when we're thinking about, financial literacy and taking full advantage of all of the financial instruments that are out there and available to people. And I want to be clear that I am in no way saying that Black Americans are any less financially literate. In fact, there's research that demonstrates that that's not the case. But in that way, I'm just saying it's important to continue along those veins. But even, and I think it's important for us to continue not just, the professional or the pre-professional education, not everybody, becoming a doctor, a lawyer, so on. I think that's great, but I think we also need to continue to encourage entrepreneurship, right? And we need to encourage people taking risk and starting businesses and using that creativity that we know exists within the Black community to capitalize on that and become producers and owners, right? So to that extent, understanding the ins and outs of small business ownership and how to grow your business, that type of education is important. One of the things I mentioned in my op-ed is that, again, people who are interested in seeing that type of growth in the Black community could volunteer their time and resources to put on small business workshops and things like that. Right? That's a possibility. It doesn't always have to be within the formal education sector. That we get education from lots of different sources is important.
So you talked about a potential for a perverse incentive to the payer, which would be, I guess, white Americans or the government, if Black people don't have production mechanisms put in place to take advantage of reparations, like we spoke about earlier. Do you think that maybe using, like I said earlier, this as a potential economic stimulus, in terms of marketing this concept, do you think that would be something that, some strategists that are talking about reparations could use to incentivize maybe some of these big corporations or trade organizations to really try to push this through, or do you think that's not something that's logical?
Well, it's not necessarily the way I would go, but I have, it's interesting you say that, I kind of said something like this when I was talking with a friend about reparations the other day, in kind of a flip sort of way, in that, well, if people think, because there are people out there who think, if you give Black people reparations in the form of a cash payment, they're just going to go out and spend it, right? Consumption spending. They're going to buy, cars and whatever, which completely all of our research points to the contrary. But if you thought that was the case, then if you're someone who, owns businesses that would benefit from that, then you should be all for it, right? You should be looking at that as a bonanza, as, oh, look, if African Americans get checks, then that money's going to come straight to my business, right? So I said that in a flip sort of way because the logic on the other side, I think the people who oppose reparations seems a little twisted. If you can't, on the one hand, say, oh, I don't think, I don't want to give Black people any money, and then the other hand say, well, they're just going to spend it on, consumption, because if you really believe that, then you should be supporting reparations, because it'll just go line your own pocket. Right?
Well, I say that because I was watching an old episode of The Chappelle Show where it was the reparations episode, and he, the reporter, he was supposedly reporting from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and he was saying that Sprint is up 100% because over 2 million delinquent accounts was paid for, and I know I'm joking now, but I'm just trying to figure out anything that could be beneficial towards us getting this as a necessity due to the wealth gap and the calcification of wealth and automation being a reality, and just all of the struggles that Black people face.
Yeah. Well, so the only problem I have with that, right? So the reason I say I was being flip was because, right, that argument is based off of a myth of Black overconsumption, right? And so we have, research by Derek Hamilton, Sandy Garrity, I think in Gina Chitegi, like there's research that demonstrates that, once we control for income differences, that Black people are no more likely to overconsume, right? They have similar savings rates. And so I think that the danger of, even feeding into that argument, even if it's just to get political support from some of those larger companies, is that it feeds into this myth of Black irresponsibility with money, right, which is a complete myth, but that I think even some Black people buy into.
Totally agree. Just wanted to throw that out.
Excellent.
So just to wrap up here, what are some ways that you would suggest that Black people put into practice to be more of critical thinkers in terms of solving problems, whether it be the wealth gap or reparations or education? What do you suggest that Black people put into practice every day to try to be more critical thinkers?
So I mean that's an interesting question. So in my view, in my experience, I find that the Black people that I meet and talk to are thinking critically about these things, right? So let me say that. So that's my first thought. My first thought is that I talk to people who are PhD economists, but I also talk to people who have dropped out of high school, right? Like it's not an education thing that means that you can think critically about these issues. And across those populations of people that I talk to, I find very interesting, very creative thoughts, very deep thoughts about how the world operates. Right, people who have a better understanding about how this world operates than the people with PhDs. So I say all that to say, I think that we just have to continue to question assumptions that people make about our community, question assumptions that people make about others. I often think that if we wouldn't want people making stereotypes about us, we have to continue to question and prevent people from spreading stereotypes about other groups. And I think that my message there is unity, right? So we are not a numerical majority in this country. And that means that anything that we hope to get passed as far as legislation, in this country, we need a coalition of supporters and people who also believe in reducing racial wealth gaps and so on. So I think that at the end of the day, I guess I would say think about ways in which we can unify people and continue to question assumptions.
Yeah, I definitely think that's logical about, you said something about asking questions. That's definitely something that I would suggest for sure, because I'm someone that would be classified as a millennial. And, I'm not outside of business. I'm not surrounded in a situation where there's a lot of people who have PhDs and, are highly interested in this type of topic. They're just, average Black people like me. And, good thing for me, I went to college and was able to engage in some entrepreneurship endeavors, but I'm by no stretch of the imagination confused in terms of the type of system that we're in and the necessity of this type of program, because although I might have some semblance of success, my mom, my grandma, my grandpa, my brothers and my sisters, they still have to deal with this type of system that I'm subjected to as well. So, asking questions, like you said, I would suggest to the listeners journaling, especially if you have a job and you're not an entrepreneurial journal. Date, time, and a quick summary. If you have a phone, maybe you could just use a voice memo and just hey, today I dealt with this problem. Look through your employee handbook and try to figure out, if what happened to you was against policy or anything of that nature, so that, we're taking notes, we're writing, we're thinking critically. Because when you don't do that, you're in a position that you have to recall a lot of things, and, that can be used against us. So for me, I would suggest journaling and asking questions of people in power for sure. Last thing here, what suggestions would you have to put in place to help Black people to manage risk more effectively? Because that seems to be something that is an issue that people like to say in terms of why Black people are in the position they're in now, in terms of not having wealth and not attaining education. What would be your suggestions in terms of planning and managing risk?
I think even sort of the premise of that question is a little difficult for me. When I think of, the view I have in my head of the Black people, the Black women that I know, right, is a group of people who are resilient and, already manage risk, right? Like, I think that, you develop a certain set of life skills when you are living with limited wealth reserves, right? If I have something that I know I can always fall back on, well, then I may be more irresponsible with what I have. But if I don't have anything to fall back on, then I'm really, thinking about every dollar I spend, right? And so I think that, as far as Black people in general, right, on average, I can say go, and I think the evidence shows, right, that again, Black people are not over-consuming. They are not taking inordinate risk with their money. But what is the problem is that there is still structural discrimination. There's still financial discrimination, right? There's still barriers in society such that even if I do my level best, right, there are hurdles that I have to overcome just to get to sort of the same starting income and wealth level as a non-Black person in this country. And so I don't say that to mean, give up. Give up. There's no, there's no hope of you ever getting there. But I do say it to say, we are resilient people, right? We continue to demonstrate that resilience in that fight, and that if we keep working together, we can change some of these institutional barriers that are hampering us.
Well said. And the last thing that I would want to say is, putting the focus on people who can help us in terms of bettering our lives and being more aware of the system that we're dealing with. Those are the type of people that I would suggest that listeners get involved with, because, as Dr. Francis said, we are resilient people as Black Americans. Very resilient, and we've been able to survive. And it's important for Black people to dig deep and work together, because cooperation is going to be central to solving this problem. And putting the focus on the people who are, maintaining and expanding the system is something that I would put into play in terms of, if you want to get angry at other Black people because they don't support reparations or do,
right,
just put the focus on, hey, this person might have a disagreement with me, but let's focus on who's actually doing this and what can we do to solve the problem. That's the focus that I want to drive people to, whether you support reparations or not, although I do. But
well said.
I just want to put that out there for people to, on a closing note of what I would suggest people do. So is there any more research that you have about this topic that we could probably look into?
Yeah. Do you want me to just sort of send?
Yes, if you can, for sure. So we could put it up for sure.
Okay, absolutely. I will
Perfect.
just say an interesting book for people to read who are interested in the history of some of these topics is "My Face is Black is True" by Mary Frances Berry. It's about Callie House, who was a formerly enslaved washerwoman who sort of fought for old age pensions for formerly enslaved people around the turn of the century, around the 1900s. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah.
Definitely want to look that up as well. Do you have any social media or anything else you want to promote before we close out?
Absolutely. I am on Twitter at Dania Francis, Dania Francis with an IS. And my website is just daniafrancis.com.
Perfect. So we're going to put that in the show notes and also include some of the book suggestions that you gave as well, so that we have as much information as we possibly can. It's not just me just jibber-jabbing with Dr. Francis here. Thank you for your time.
I just wanted to say I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you so much for your questions and even you're doing this and bringing these type of questions to the forefront. So thank you.
Well, I care, so I have an incentive to do it. So, in economic terms, I have an incentive. So, thank you again, and we'll be in contact for sure.
Absolutely.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay up to date for more videos by clicking the bell notification icon and following our social media. For any of the people, groups, companies, or videos that were referenced in this video, don't forget to check the description and/or the pinned comment section. The Question Lane, solving problems through the process of questions and answers.